Welcome to Invisibly Unwell. I'm your host, Paige Lavelle. I've spent the past 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder. I've worked hard to get where I am professionally, but there's a side of me that few are aware of. I am also an autoimmune warrior, an eating disorder survivor, an author, and now a podcast host. My goal here is to educate and empower high-achieving women navigating autoimmune conditions and other chronic illnesses, who at the same time are also dealing with challenges that all high-achieving women face, like disordered eating, perfectionism, and people-pleasing. Invisibly Unwell is what I wish I had at the start of my journey. You are not alone. I hope my story and the stories and expertise of my guests will provide you with knowledge and ideas and empower you to share your own story and advocate for the life you've worked so hard to build. Quick disclaimer, this podcast is meant for general information purposes only and should not be taken as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I am thrilled to announce today's guest, Lilly Stairs. She is the founder and principal of Patient Authentic, where she builds authentic programs at the intersection of marketing and patient engagement. And more recently, she's the founder and CEO of the Chronic Boss Collective. It's a membership for ambitious women living with chronic conditions designed to help them dream big and prioritize their health. No trade-offs. I met Lilly when I was invited to attend the first annual Rare Autoimmune Emerging Leaders Workshop. She is just an incredible advocate for the autoimmune space. She has the trifecta, so she has 3 autoimmune diseases just like I do. And I really feel that you are just going to get an incredible amount of motivation, support, and information from her today. Welcome to the podcast, Lilly Stairs. I'd love to start by you just telling a little bit about yourself, why you founded Patient Authentic, and just a little bit of your story, where you started and what got you to this point today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Paige. I'm so excited to be here. I was diagnosed with a couple of autoimmune diseases. I like to say I'm a triple threat. I was diagnosed at 7 with psoriasis. And then at 19, I was diagnosed back to back with Crohn's disease and psoriatic arthritis. And it was an extremely severe onset. And came out of nowhere. Basically, the arthritis was total body, to the point that my mom had to help dress me. And the Crohn's, I had bleeding ulcers in my small intestine. I couldn't even drink water without feeling pain. And that was at 19. When I was in college, I had just wrapped up my freshman year. And I loved I was at Northeastern, being in Boston, living independently. And my world was really turned upside down. And so I remember, like, a really defining moment for me was when I was hospitalized for the Crohn's disease. I was sitting in my hospital bed. I had just been diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis 6 months before. I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I've received 2 diagnoses that I'm going to live with for the rest of my life. What's going on here? And so I typed in Crohn's disease and psoriatic arthritis, and what came up at the term autoimmune. And I had never heard the term in my life. And I was angry because, come to find out, there are an estimated over 50 million Americans who are living with an autoimmune condition. And we don't talk about it. We don't look at them from an umbrella perspective. We recognize them individually. And even then, people don't really understand autoimmune like they do something like a cancer diagnosis, right? There's just not that empathy there. So anyways, that's my very, very brief diagnostic odyssey. And over the next couple of years, like many, I went through trial and error with medications and diet and all the things. And I have been very fortunate to be in medically controlled remission for the past 8 years. And I have used that remission to do as much good as I can. And I now work full-time in healthcare, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, I'd love to jump into that, but I just want to jump off of a few other topics you brought up when you were just sharing. So it's interesting that you didn't hear autoimmune immediately. So to share a little bit about my story, I was first diagnosed with limited scleroderma when I was 13. Prior to that, they thought it was Raynaud's phenomenon on its own. For anyone listening that's not familiar, that's when your hands turn white and then a deep shade of a bluish purple. when you are exposed to any cold. I would say extreme cold, but it's not. I mean, I can be a little bit chilly and they turn purple. So I was aware that it was autoimmune from the start. But interestingly enough, about 12 years after that, so when I was 24, I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism because my hair was falling out and I was having trouble with weight gain. I had been an athlete my whole life. I danced, I swam, and I was like, what is going on? I'm working out. I don't get it. And I was having trouble concentrating, which was very unlike me. And they just told me it was hypothyroidism. Here, take your levothyroxine. Everything's going to be fine. They increased my dose every 8 to 12 weeks from then on because every time I got blood work, it wasn't enough until finally I went to an integrative physician. I could go on about my exploration of the integrative functional space. I almost bankrupted myself in that space. So I think it's incredible. I also think there's some predatory stuff going on there. So I was told in that first appointment when they looked at my labs, like, oh, you have Hashimoto's. This was 5 years later. And I had never been even told the term Hashimoto's. I just thought that I had an underactive thyroid. I had no idea that it was related to my immune system or that it was an autoimmune disease, period. And so that was the first time I really learned about the cluster effect, how, like you said, you have a triple threat. I'm a triple threat as well with scleroderma, Sjogren's, and Hashimoto's. So it's really validating, for lack of a better term there, just when you hear other people that went through the same thing. I'd love to hear, because I've heard a little bit about your story from personal exchanges we've had together. You said you've experienced medical gaslighting. That is something that I have experienced multiple times as well. And I'd love, if you're open to it, to share a little more about that experience to help anyone listening feel seen and heard if they've gone through that same thing.
100%. I'm so glad you brought this up. I have been working in this space and interacting with women living with autoimmune conditions for over a decade now. And every single woman I talk to, I've engaged with hundreds at this point, has their own medical gaslighting experience. And that's so alarming to me. and it's sad. But my personal experience was, I've had several, but I would say the most stark experience was when I was experiencing this, like, on a scale of 1 to 10 pain. It was a 100, which they say you're not supposed to say that, but it was very intense in my stomach. I had the bleeding ulcers in my small intestine. And so I was in and out of the ER 3 times in one weekend. I was in and out of the ER 3 times in one weekend because the providers kept sending me home saying, they thought I was seeking drugs or I was faking it. It was all in my head. The all in my head concept, I think we hear a lot. And so finally they admitted me the 3rd time I went into the hospital, and come to find out they run every test in the book. And they said, we have one more test we can run. And then after that, we don't know what to do with you. And they did a pill cam. I took a pill, swallowed it, and I took pictures as it moved through my body every 3 seconds. And that's when they found the bleeding ulcers. And it's like, oh, she's not faking it. It's not all in her head.
Yeah, it feels so validating, but I'm sure as something that you said earlier, it's infuriating at the same time. I know when I first started looking at alternatives to just taking the generic levothyroxine, I was taking Armour. I know that works for some people. For me, my hair started falling out in chunks, which is a common side effect. So I went into my rheumatologist at the time. Side note, we can come back to this, how there is no specialist for autoimmunity. You go to the separate body system specialists, and there is no holistic view available. So you have to piece this all together and project manage your own healthcare, which can be overwhelming. And as someone who has perfectionist tendencies and is a very success-driven person, I let it consume me for a very long time because I wanted to just figure everything out and have it all together in one place. And it can be a lot when you're fighting the symptoms of these issues. So back to my original point there, when you talked about the medical gaslighting experience, so I went back to my rheumatologist to say, hey, I'm interested in trying these different medications for my Hashimoto's. He laughed, like not subtly either, like laughed in my face and said, oh, are you one of those people who doesn't listen to your medical professional and wants to try these new age things? And he was one of the most highly regarded rheumatologists in Houston, and Houston has the largest medical center in the world. So it wasn't like I was going to some old school person in a small town and that's the doctor everyone goes to. Like, I did my research and this guy was legit. So I knew if that happened to me in that setting, that it was something so many people experienced. And to be clear, I'm not here to demonize the medical profession in any way. I just think that it's a bit of an epidemic the way women are treated, especially women with autoimmune diseases.
100%. I mean, I could not be rolling my eyes further back into my head right now. I am so, it makes me so angry to hear this. And there's so much that needs to be done to correct this. And it's a lot of that unconscious bias training. It's getting to medical students, as soon as we can and early and often, and engaging with them and helping them to understand these conditions. And it was really interesting you brought up also this other component of going to see different specialists and project managing your care. That is 1,000% another huge problem in the autoimmune space. There's so much overlap between symptoms, conditions, specialists, and it becomes like who you do have to project manage your care. And that's a massive administrative burden to be placed on somebody who is already not feeling well, and experiencing extreme pain and fatigue and, a whole laundry list of other symptoms. And we're starting to see some centers of excellence. There are a series of centers of excellence. There's one that's relatively newer in Pittsburgh called the Autoimmunity Institute, and they bring together specialists. They're all in one room. It's amazing. They all see patients, and then they go in a round table and they talk about patients. And so these are folks who are undiagnosed. They're living with multiple autoimmune diseases, have been misdiagnosed. They've seen patients from all across the country, all 50 states. But this is really what we need. We need this type of center in every state, right? In every city that needs to exist because we're everywhere. Autoimmunity is really an epidemic in many ways. And we've got a long ways to go in understanding it.
Completely. And I think one of the major issues, especially as a female in that space, and it's 75 to 80% autoimmune patients are female.
Yeah.
I know my husband has gout. My brother has type 1 diabetes. Those are the two you hear that fall into the male space, but 90% of people I know with autoimmune conditions are women. So to have that bias in that space is super problematic when you know in your bones that something is wrong and you are dismissed, told you're drug seeking. I've had that happen to me too, when I wasn't asking for medication. So it's just a very interesting space to be in. And I don't know if you could expand on this. A lot of people I meet weren't diagnosed till they were adults. You're one of the only other people I've met who was diagnosed when we were young. Do you feel like your parents were kind of pushed in some way to just follow exactly what they said? And you, at least I was 12, so I had a little bit of awareness there. I was doing what my parents were telling me, even when there were times that they were telling me to take immunosuppressive drugs that I was like, I don't feel better, I feel worse. And my parents are of the generation, they meant very well, but they were like, this is what the doctor said, just do it. And it wasn't until I became an adult that I felt a little more empowered. And to be clear, they were well-intended. They were doing what they thought was best for me. But that was something I look back on. And I'm like, when you're diagnosed with this kind of a condition as a kid, you're pretty powerless.
Yeah. And I was sort of skirting that line of independence, but also reliance on my parents. And so I was 19. And well, when I was a kid, I guess if I take it back, because I was 7 when I was diagnosed with psoriasis. And yeah, I mean, I was absolutely mostly just following my mom and what the doctor said. And we followed what the doctor said for the most part. And I also think, when I was 7, there was not really, we weren't Googling things. My parents didn't have that same access to the internet at that time. And so you had less ways to actually be empowered as a patient or as a care partner. And so, yeah, we listened and we just followed what they advised. And then when I was 19, that was a little bit different in the sense that we didn't always just take what the doctor said as Bible, if you will. So that was when my mom was very concerned. She was hearing, the black box warnings on these drugs and said, I want to look at alternatives. And so I had my own experience with functional medicine. I'll get back to the childhood piece, but I just want to say a word about functional medicine and conventional medicine, I often feel like it's separation of church and state. It's Republicans versus Democrats. That's how I look at it. And it shouldn't be that way. There is merit to functional medicine. There is merit to conventional medicine, particularly in autoimmune. And it is finding what is the right cocktail for you. And everybody's diet's going to look different. Everybody's supplements are going to look different. Everybody's medicine is going to look different because these diseases are so unique. They present so differently. And so we did explore some of those alternatives. And that was hard because I did follow what my mom wanted me to do. And I did a full elimination diet, and I did it for a long time. And it was incredibly challenging on my mental health being in college and trying to do an elimination diet. It was just so isolating. And so yeah, I think I did follow what they said. And I think maybe had I been a little bit more empowered and a little bit older, I may have pushed back and said, this is not what I want to do right now. This isn't for me.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the food factor as well. So I explored functional medicine. There are things that I discovered that I'm extremely grateful for in that space. Like I said, I had no idea what Hashimoto's thyroiditis was until I went to a functional physician. And I think that there needs, I don't say there should be, there absolutely needs to be a middle ground where we need to have someone looking at us holistically, looking at our lifestyle choices and our nutrition. But we also need to make room for modern medicine. So the fact that they tend to be adversaries is very problematic for the patient, because I've incorporated a lot of lifestyle changes and diet changes, and I also have to take medication. So I don't want to be treated like a failure on one side for not just finding the perfect diet to fix me. And I don't want to be treated like I don't mind the word woo-woo, but I don't want to be treated like a woo-woo person when someone says it in a derogatory manner, because it's a holistic thing. It wasn't until I started looking at my mental and emotional issues and struggles that I was able to move the needle physically at all. And it wasn't until I was told, like, this is your immune system. Everything is related to an immune response to something. I could go off about how much more research we need into the root cause for hours. So I'll spare that for this particular episode. But it's just difficult because you're trying to find your own middle ground with no support on either side for finding that middle ground. And the only support we have out there is finding other people, specifically in this case, like other women that are experiencing this same thing. And I will say one thing that I struggled with in the functional space, I have a history of disordered eating. I had a full-blown diagnosed eating disorder. I was bulimic, and I had a lot of mental and emotional issues growing up that led to that. I also think having to feel like I had to constantly prove I wasn't sick from age 12 to 18 when that eating disorder finally manifested definitely played into it. It wasn't all of it, but it played into it that I was trying to overcompensate all the time and just achieve my gold stars and check all the boxes. And I never looked up to stop and be like, is this what I really want? Am I studying what I want? Am I pursuing the life that I want? And I continued down that trail till my 30s before I reassessed and made a lot of changes. But I think that being like a success-driven, high-achieving female in modern society, you don't really want to reveal that chink in your armor. So you do a lot to downplay it and a lot to keep it bottled in. And I'm glad you mentioned the elimination diet in that space. So I've been on several elimination diets. Every time I got food sensitivity testing, it came up different than it did the time before. And I feel like, yes, I was no longer experiencing bulimia, but I became what I think they would now categorize as orthorexia. I've never gotten a diagnosis, so I'm not stepping in and making that as a medical declaration. But I was obsessive. I mean, I read every label of everything, and I would kind of annoyingly preach from an ivory tower to everyone around me, like, how dare you eat gluten? Like, dairy is so bad for you. All these things that I now know are not totally true, and I don't have celiac, so I go off of it for periods of time because there is some research to say that gluten-free helps with your thyroid. That said, I felt very isolated. Like, I would go to parties and I couldn't eat or drink anything that anyone had. And I felt like I was being told by the practitioners I was working with, like, you can do this, it's not that hard. And so that totally played into that perfectionism tendency that I have, where it was like, no, like, I am not eating any of that stuff. I am not going to drink any of that stuff. And I basically became like a zealot. And it took a long time for me to realize exactly what you're saying. All of what works for us is unique because our health situation and our life circumstances are all unique. So whatever supplements the latest influencer is telling me to take might not work for me. Whatever, latest healing modality I'm exploring, I might take a little piece away from it, but I don't need to become like a full-fledged member of that particular group. And I think that there's not enough people out there being honest and open and vulnerable about their story to be like, yeah, I really like yoga. I don't do yoga every single day, or I don't practice yoga every single day. Or like I've read books like the 5 a.m. Club to try to be more productive. I'm not going to wake up at 5 a.m. every day, but there's stuff in that book that I took away that's great. So my long-winded response to what you said is that I feel like there has to be a middle ground. There has to be people sharing, that there's so much information out there, and you are able to take little pieces away to construct what your healthy lifestyle is.
Yes. And so much there and so much that I relate to. And I have two comments. One being that this huge disparity and divide between conventional and holistic functional medicine is actually very dangerous to patients, in that, like you said, you can't talk to, in many cases, conventional doctors will, they're totally hands off with functional medicine, and it actually would be really beneficial for them to be knowing and understanding what supplements are you taking and how are you adjusting your diet. That should be something that you're talking about with both doctors. Your functional medicine doctor should know what you're doing from a conventional perspective, and your conventional doctor should know what you're doing from a functional perspective. So there's some safety that goes into that, that concerns me. And then also, because functional medicine doesn't get the same funding in research, we don't have the same safety precautions around supplements that get approved and the way that those different diets work, which is a shame, because some of the supplements and diets, they do work, but there's just not the funding to have them go through a trial to prove that and then have them prescribed. So anyways, I mean, that's really going into a whole other component of our healthcare system, which I don't want to touch right now. But I do want to talk about my own personal experiences. You brought up some of this disordered eating, because I as I was just telling you before we started, jumped on for the podcast, I've been in therapy for a year, and I've just started to realize that I actually think I have experienced disordered eating because of my autoimmune conditions and the diets that I tried to help keep them under control. And so I did. They were just so restricting to me. I'm such a foodie. I love food. I love to go out to dinner. I mean, that is how you socialize, especially in your 20s living in the city. Like, you're out and about, you're going for drinks, you're going out for food. And yes, there are more gluten-free options now, but like, I was gluten-free, dairy-free, and refined sugar-free very strictly. And then I started to give myself, okay, I'll do 80-20. And I counted how many meals there were in a week. And I was like, okay, well, I can do 2 or 3 meals that have gluten and dairy. And I would like binge eat at those meals because I was like, oh, this is my time to get the gluten and dairy in. And I can't take it home tomorrow because then tomorrow is a different meal. So I have to eat it all now. So it just really messed with my brain. And I didn't appreciate that or realize that. And so the thing, if there are people listening that I want them to know, is that it's okay to be on medicine. I'm on medicine and I am so freaking grateful for it. Like, I've been on medicine for 8 years. I don't have a symptom or a side effect, which is like, knock on wood, amazing. And there are medication shamers out there. It's worked really well for me, and there is no shame in it. There is no shame in that. And I've adjusted my diet here and there. I've adjusted my lifestyle, but like, I'm sorry, I don't want to go off my medicine and try to control my autoimmune disease through diet right now. It's just too hard and too taxing on my mental health. And so I'm not going to do it. But I believe it can be the right thing for some people. So anyways, that's my whole spiel. You got to do what's best for you. And we need to stop judging each other in this space.
No, I agree. I wish so many more practitioners, people who have come up with these various exercise, diet, even spiritual practice approaches would offer what they've learned and what they want to put out in the world without saying every other way is wrong.
Right.
It's just a very isolating space to be in. It becomes very frustrating. I know for years, I never talked about any of this stuff that I was dealing with because you're just so frustrated that you're like, whatever, I'll just put my head down and deal and continue to climb the corporate ladder and keep my social calendar completely packed and just pretend everything's going to be fine. That did not work out well, as you can imagine. But it's true. I really appreciate you sharing that because I feel like for anyone listening, I met Lilly because I applied to go to an emerging leaders in, was it titled chronic illness or autoimmune?
That was the Rare Autoimmune Emerging Leaders Program.
Awesome. So it was a wonderful experience and I was very grateful to be accepted to attend. And I connected with all these other, mostly females. There were some men there who were really brave in sharing their chronic illness stories. But just connecting with other people that were like me, we work every day. We have a lot of goals. We're fortunate enough that we have a condition where we're still, for the most part, able to live a relatively normal life. And I think that is what pushed me. I've thought about doing this podcast for, like a decade probably at this point. But I finally felt like if I don't share what I'm going through, I'm doing a disservice, especially to the people that aren't able to live a relatively, obviously I use the word normal in a relative sense at all times, but aren't able to live a relatively normal life. And so I want to share so other people that are struggling in the shadows because they can put on a mask like I had to do for many years. And even more so for the people who really can't get out of bed some days and can't really make it to work. So I also find, and I know you and I have talked about this before, there is this subculture within the autoimmune and chronic illness space. I believe the original motivation behind it was very well intended. There was an article written about spoonies. You only have so many spoons every day regarding your energy, what you can give your energy to. I still love that concept. I always loved the book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, because I thought it was a book about not caring. And I read it and it was like, no, you only have so many fucks to give. So you have to decide what those are. And you have to be willing to let the other ones go and not put all of your effort into these random smaller things that don't really mean a lot to you or to what your life's mission and goals are. So I think the Spoonie movement started in a wonderful way. I know personally, it made me feel validated and seen after feeling like I was just between a rock and a hard place for so many years between the functional and the conventional medicine space. And so I was like, oh, these people understand me. And I quickly realized it can be a bit, to speak candidly, addictive to be in that space because you'll get in these Facebook groups or Slack groups and all sorts of other spaces. And it's just let me tell you how horrible I feel today, or let me tell you how horrible my symptoms are. And I was like, oh my God, I feel like I'm in this one-up competition about who is sicker. And it's not that I don't feel for these people. It's awful. I can't imagine like how bad some of these people are, how bad some of their symptoms are, how much of a difficult struggle it is for them day to day. But I also feel like if someone's recently diagnosed and they're really struggling with their symptoms, it can be a very negative place for them to be. And so that's something I want to call out, like I said, not to demonize these people, but to call it what it is and hope that it gives someone inspiration to connect in a different way, in a way that's more positivity driven, a place where you can be vulnerable and share your story, but where your focus is more on, okay, how do I move forward? How do I find that unique set of things to help with my health without feeling like I need to constantly validate how sick I am?
It is bananas to me that there is this subculture of like, who's the sickest? And that's who wants to be the sickest? That's not a good thing. So and I'm really glad you brought this up because this is why I'm starting the Chronic Boss Collective, which is a space for ambitious businesswomen living with chronic conditions to network and to dream big and to maintain their health. So it's all about career women living with chronic conditions. There are a lot of us out there. There are so many of us who are high achievers, to your point, high achievers. We're making a difference in the world. And we're also holding space that we live with chronic conditions at the same time. And that creates a unique set of circumstances and challenges. And, but it doesn't mean that we can't do and be great. But it's a matter of like, how do we do that on our own terms? And how do we do that in a safe and healthy way that we're able to not see our illnesses like fall out of remission or end up sicker because we're not taking care of ourselves and we're working 1,000,000 hours a week. So I am excited about that. I'm excited to create a space for that. And I've never felt that there's been a space for me in the chronic illness community. To your point, The Spoon Theory by Christine Miserandino, amazing. I love the concept. I cried the first time I read it because I felt like finally someone understood. But then as I did delve deeper into the culture, it just wasn't a fit for me because I wanted to advocate. I wanted to talk about chronic conditions and help raise awareness and help support others. But I also wanted to have my career and be ambitious and be driven. And I actually felt like in some cases, I was excluded from the community for that. And so I'm creating a space for those who want to be both and do both. And the other big thing that's important to me is that young women who are diagnosed, so most women are diagnosed with autoimmune conditions between the ages of 15 and 30. I want someone when they're diagnosed, when they Google their condition, I want them to see the Chronic Boss Collective. And I want them to understand this is going to be a part of your life, but you can still do, and you can be, and you can achieve, and you can live out your dreams, and you can do it safely. And I don't want them to Google their condition and have the first thing that comes up be a depressing article about how challenging it is to live with chronic conditions. And it's okay to hold space for that, but we also need to show people that they can keep living and dreaming.
That's extremely inspiring. I'm really excited when you shared that you were starting the collective. And for anyone listening, I am a collective member, and I'm very excited to see how it grows because there's such a need for that in this space. And similar to you, I felt like because I would say 90% of my symptoms are completely invisible. And a lot of people with autoimmune diseases, women especially, can relate to that. The only thing that you can see is if I'm cold, my hands turn purple. Kind of obvious, but I know how to hide them at the same time. So you would never know talking to me that there's something wrong or that I struggle with any sort of health condition. I would probably have to share with you for you to have any idea. And that's a blessing and a curse, right? So I am able to hide it to an alarming degree at times because I can just pretend I'm fine. And when I'm really struggling and when I really don't take time to rest and recover, and I've learned the hard way what happens when I do that. On the other hand, I've talked to people who have conditions that manifest in a way that is much more physically obvious to those around us. And I've been met with I don't want to put words in anyone else's mouth, but what was received on my end as resentment towards me because I was able to function in a relatively normal way. Now, do I feel for those people? I can't imagine. I haven't had to be in a situation where I have a condition that presents and that I cannot hide in any way if I'm in a situation where I don't want to appear that there's something in me that's defective or problematic. And I'm not calling those people defective, but something that can be perceived as a weakness, especially if you're very driven and you really want to have a voice in the world, in a world that's not particularly kind to people who show any sort of weakness. So I feel for those people, but I definitely felt very isolated because it was like, who are you to be here? And so I really struggled in silence for a long time. And it's been so wonderful to meet people like you who are sharing their story and who can relate to that and want to make sure that any woman who gets diagnosed in the future or finally gets that physician that's not gaslighting her and she gets a diagnosis and realizes, oh my God, this isn't all in my head. God, the amount of times I've been asked if it's in my head, I could just go on. That they have a resource, that they are able to find something that speaks to them, that resonates with them. So thank you so much for putting that out into the world. And I'm very excited to see what becomes of that over the long term, especially.
Oh, I'm so glad you're excited. And I'm excited too. And I'd actually just love to comment on the visibly disabled versus invisible disabilities or illnesses. It's such an interesting nuance to the different experiences we have when you have a visible versus an invisible disability. And one of the things that actually I have found very challenging with invisible is are the times where there are some times where I wish actually like people could see, like, yeah, like when I'm being gaslit in the doctor's office, or when I'm on the train. I remember, so when I was first diagnosed and I was sick and I had to commute to, I was in a co-op program, I would ride the train during rush hour, the MBTA in Boston, and it would be like standing room only, packed. And I remember if I had a seat, I had people looking at me and giving me stares because here I am, this seemingly young, healthy 19-year-old, and I'm using quotation marks, young, healthy 19-year-old. Actually, I have total body arthritis at this point in time. I'm very sick. And I have people looking at me like, oh, I should be giving a pregnant woman or an elderly person my seat. And I'm like, I'm probably worse off than them, but people just, they can't see that. And so that, I think, that's where invisible illnesses have their own challenges. But I can also appreciate that if I had a visible disability, there are probably times where I would want to be able to hide it. And so, I think everybody has their cross to bear, and there are challenges associated with both. But yeah, to your point, just because we have invisible disabilities or illnesses, it doesn't make them any less challenging than a physical disability, right? They just present differently.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you sharing that story. I've had something similar before. So just to shed some light on some of the issues people with Raynaud's deal with, if you have a more severe case, which I do have, and your hands turn purple, you can end up with sores on your hands that they're gangrenous sores. They turn green. They're excruciatingly painful. And to the point where the only treatment while you are waiting for them to heal, and there's a variety of things you can do to help them heal, is to take in very strong painkiller. So I had a script. Thankfully, my parents were very on top of managing it. And I was never someone who, despite what some people said to me, was a drug-seeking person. I totally feel for those people that are. I can't imagine being in some of the levels of pain people are in. But I was walking around as a 16-year-old with an open script for codeine, and people would just look at me, and I was on the swim team and the dance team. And it was like, if I just had to take a breath or like sit out for a minute and dance practice because my hand was hurting so bad that I couldn't even like count music, like that's how painful it was. I was just looked at like, you are such a lazy, unmotivated little spoiled brat. And I had a coach who kind of enforced that culture. But it was really difficult. Like I believed them. I felt like I was being a spoiled little brat. And it wasn't until I was older and I read the scale of pain for those sores that people experience that they are very high. Like I could have easily gone in and been like, if you touch my finger, I'm at like an 8 or a 9 on the pain scale. Cause I would just tears would start streaming down my face and I would just curl up in a ball until the pain went away. And it's just luckily I haven't had one in many years, but it's difficult because if you can pass as not having any sort of disability. And to be clear, like when I apply for jobs, I am qualified as clicking disabled and I don't. And that's a whole other thing that we could have a whole other episode about. But it's like, I still have this thing in me, like I'll fully acknowledge it, where I'm like, I struggle with saying that I am because I feel like I'm not deserving of that qualification. And then I feel like, oh God, what if I take that away from someone who has like something that presents in a more physical sense? Or like you said, someone who is elderly or someone that I think has quote unquote earned that more. So it's a struggle that I know I have, and it's a struggle that I think so many women in this position deal with.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting because I also struggle with the word disabled. I actually don't really use it for myself. And when I remember when I was in college and had these diagnoses, people kept telling me, and my parents said, well, maybe you should go to the Center for Disabilities. And I'm like, but I don't have a disability. But I did I do. And at like when my condition is flaring, I do. And so, yeah, it is a push and pull. And I feel that like, you're like, I don't want to take that away from someone and it feels like the physical, if it's visibly, I don't know what I'm trying, if it's
I know what you're saying. Like if it's something that
honestly,
someone can see with the naked eye
yeah, I
versus
don't, oh
something that
my
you'd have to
goodness.
explain your health history. Yeah.
I need more coffee. I've got a large Dunkin's next to me, but
Love it.
I've not drank enough of it
It's
clearly.
very Boston of you. I love it.
I know, here I am talking about the MBTA. I'm drinking my Dunkin' Donuts.
I love
Yeah, wicked smart. So anyways, but yeah, no, the other thing I actually wanted to comment on that you said was around laziness and being told, like, that is something that I've experienced. And I know a lot of other women have experienced living with autoimmune conditions that drives me nuts. And as a really ambitious, career-driven woman like yourself, like many of the women that I encounter, I've actually been called lazy as well when I was flaring and not feeling well. And like I couldn't even take a shower without feeling exhausted, but people they just don't understand it. They can't grasp that because you look okay. They just think when you're sitting on the couch all day, it's because you're lazy. You should be trying to rise above it. And there are some times where you really can't. And it's taken a lot of education and time for me to help people in my life understand that. But I do think there is, unfortunately, this perception, and we do get labeled as lazy sometimes. And there's nothing worse, as an ambitious, career-driven woman, to be called lazy. It's such a slap in the face. And so it was interesting to me that you brought that up, because I think that's another real challenge living with these conditions.
No, absolutely. And I mean, if anything, when I was told I was lazy, I would just double down and ignore my fatigue and get myself into a very physically unwell state. So it's when you're dealing with people like you and I that are type A, I think it's safe to say we're both type A. When you call us lazy, it hurts. I mean, that's a whole other thing I could unpack around perfectionism and how we develop it and all of that. But it hurts. Like it cuts me to the core if I'm called lazy or that I'm not trying. And so before I had the self-awareness and like the emotional maturity to realize like what people are saying has a lot more to do with them than it does with me, I would just be like, okay, you want to see lazy? And I would just work 10 times harder and put myself into just a terrible physical state. So it's very problematic. And one thing I wanted to touch on that you said, you talked about it's taken a lot of education to the people in your support system and your community. I've struggled with that as well. And I got to the point, I used to get very frustrated with them for their questions about like, is it in your head? Or are you sure you're not just like going through something and, yada, yada, yada. But it's also at the same time, I try to have a little compassion because there is such a lack of awareness, especially in our country. I assume it's pretty global, but a lack of awareness around autoimmunity and just the magnitude. I mean, if you combine all of the autoimmune patients, it dwarfs cancer, I want to say over three times if you add it together. Another issue with having no specialty for autoimmunity and everyone's separated. If you have MS, you go to a neurologist. If you have Raynaud's, you go to a rheumatologist. If you have Hashimoto's, you go to an endocrinologist. There you see off the top of your head, I'm already having to see two different specialists on top of my primary care practitioner. So there's just not enough knowledge out there, at least general knowledge, unless you're in the medical field, they hear about it. But at the same time, when I start opening up that I have an autoimmune disease, everyone I know knows someone who has an autoimmune disease if they haven't dealt with it themselves. So I feel like I would love to hear your thoughts, because I know you're very involved with the Autoimmune Association and other organizations that are one of their mission statements and goals is to spread the awareness and to create that unified specialty for autoimmunity. I'd love for you to speak to the need for there to just be more knowledge put out there about autoimmunity and how much of an epidemic, I think it's safe to call it an epidemic if it's dwarfing cancer three times over, that it is in society today.
I am so glad you brought this up. It's one of the topics I'm most passionate about. We really need to look at autoimmune diseases from an umbrella perspective. And if we can get the light bulb to go off in people's heads that, oh yeah, I have a friend that has celiac. I know someone that has MS. I know someone that has lupus, and how all of those are connected. They all share the same similar root causes. They all share similar symptoms. They all have similar treatment pathways. That's going to be essential, because awareness, it drives funding. Funding drives research. and advocacy and all of these other pillars that we need to really move the needle in autoimmune disease. And so it's one of the most important things that we can do as advocates is to try to draw those parallels for people. So instead of just talking about one condition, when you hear I always try to say, oh, I have 3 autoimmune diseases. A lot of us have multiple. And so I like saying that outright and helping people understand what that really means to live with these conditions, because there is also a lack of empathy around that. Again, when somebody is diagnosed with cancer, we automatically have empathy. We understand. We just don't have that same level of empathy with autoimmune. And so, I think there is a need to just keep, all I can ever say is like, just tell anyone you meet. I go on dates. I tell all my dates, and I look at it as, even if I don't have a good date, I'm like, well, I have one more person that I educated about autoimmune disease. That's actually how I think about it, which is kind of hilarious, and goes to show you like what a nut I am and how much I care about all this.
I mean, I feel like if you're on a date with someone, they should know that this is like your absolute peak passion in your life. So I totally get it.
Yeah. So yeah, we've got, and we are making progress. So what is exciting is that actually, the Autoimmune Association was a big driver behind us getting NIH. So the NIH is opening an office for autoimmune disease research, which is so exciting. It's also a little depressing because it should have been in place a long time ago. But here we are, and we're getting it now. And it's actually going to sit under the Office for Women's Research. So it's working with it. It's acknowledging that this is a women's health issue and or women's health epidemic, really. And so now our goal is to try to drive more funding there, because we need to understand this root cause. If we can unlock root cause and we can unlock more research into these conditions, there is the potential to develop very serious, real treatments and cures for all autoimmune diseases because they're so connected.
No, absolutely. I mean, the fact that you and I both are sitting here and we each have 3, if that's enough to tell you that these are connected. I don't think that my body systems exist in a silo. And that's why I really struggle with the current layout and structure within the medical field, that you just go to whatever body system presents and act as if that doesn't affect the rest of your body. So yeah, that's a major passion area for me as well. I'm so excited you bring that up on first dates. I think that's awesome.
All the time. I'm like, how many people can I educate in my lifetime?
No, it's wonderful. So I would say thank you so much for coming. This has just been incredible. And I just I think the biggest step that we have to take to move forward in this space is for people to be more open and to be more vulnerable. And for people, especially like you and I, where we have careers, we have a life, we are able to function in society relatively well, to be vulnerable and share our stories with just complete honesty in the hopes that it helps someone else who might be a few steps behind us on that path and discovering their own unique health situation and what helps them the most. One thing I would love for you to share is, what if someone, say they recently got diagnosed, or they finally found someone who wasn't gaslighting them, and then they realize that there is an actual cause behind these symptoms that they're experiencing. What is something that you feel like is your biggest lesson that if you could talk to that person, that you would tell them?
I would say that there's a couple things. It's not going to be just one thing. One, and we talked about this, what works for one person does not work for all people. You need to find the path that works for you and stay laser focused on that. Don't get caught up on, I heard so-and-so did this, I should be doing that. You should be doing nothing. You should be doing what is best for you. Do what works for you. So that's, and find other people who resonate with you. Don't feel that you have to, don't stick around in a community that's not a fit for you. Find other people who are going to cheer you on and support you. That's one thing. 2, that's if you're recently diagnosed, you will be okay. You can live a very full life with autoimmune disease, with chronic conditions. You may have to adjust course. It may look different than how you thought it was going to look, but it can also end up being really magical. And so enjoy the journey and figuring that out. And this one's like a little bit of a tougher pill to swallow, but it's that it can take trial and error. It takes time to figure it out. And so having patience and understanding that it may take a little bit of time before you get there, but there's so much work being done. There's so much hope in this space. There's a ton of research going on. There are a number of treatment options across a lot of the autoimmune conditions. And, we've got functional medicine, we've got conventional medicine. There are avenues. Keep being your own advocate to fight for what feels good for you.
Thank you. I could not agree with those 3 lessons more, and I really appreciate you sharing. So last but not least, if your story and everything that you've been sharing resonates with someone listening, where can they find you if they want to connect or work with you in a professional capacity?
Yeah, thank you. So I would say find me on LinkedIn. I'm at Lilly Stairs, stairs like going up and down. And I'm on Instagram. You can find me chronicbosscollective.com if you're interested in learning more about the Chronic Boss Collective. And then I'm also involved in patient engagement and marketing consulting. And that's through my consultancy, Patient Authentic, at patientauthentic.com.
Thank you so much. I'm honored that you took the time to be a guest on this podcast, Lilly.
Thank you for inviting me, Paige. You're amazing. And I'm so excited to take part. So thanks for having me.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Invisibly Unwell. If you like the show, I'd greatly appreciate if you followed it. And if you left a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is that you're listening. This allows me to keep the show going and to continue to bring on incredible guests to share their stories.